Right, well, in the agenda it says recap and conclusion, and I was going to inflict a repeat of all the slides on you at this point, but I decided that would be a waste of time. So I was going to try and summarise a few of the kind of messages we're trying to take home from this for you without repeating any slides. They're all there online if you want them. And then what we'll do, we'll just take general questions about everything that we've talked about so far in the tutorial in case you want to have questions about the bits, how they join up. So I'll leave some time for that. And then we'll finish off the tutorial with this extension section, which Zhizheng will tell us some other things we can do once we can build DNNs that do speech synthesis. Okay, so just to recap, we talked about front ends, both traditional and more novel. I think the bottom line is that your front end could produce very few features if you don't know what to do, minimally sequence of letters or just phonemes with no other features, and you could build a voice and see how well it does. And you should always try the simplest thing first. Maximally, your front end could produce all sorts of exotic features. It could use new findings from natural language processing. We could do word-to-vec to get our word vectors. We could build dependency parsers or semantic information. And there's no limit whatsoever on what we do in the front end. In fact, it's easier to do new things in the front end in this framework than perhaps it was in unit selection, because in unit selection, if we put a new feature in the front end, unless there's some weight in the target cost pointing to that feature, it won't do anything. And that's a complicated thing of how to turn a feature into a weight and a match and so on. Here, we can really just throw the kitchen sink at the problem. We can throw all features at the problem and hope that the magic of deep learning will sift through those features and find the ones that are useful. There isn't a straightforward methodology for knowing if they were useful other than putting them in and taking them out and seeing what difference it makes. But it's now really, really easy to do whatever you like in the front end, because we've seen that any feature can be encoded as one hot. So any symbolic feature that's from a fixed alphabet can be encoded as one hot. Or if it's naturally numeric, we can preserve it as a continuous valued feature. So we're now completely free to do what we like in the front end, whether it's Oliver's word vectors instead of part of speech tags, or in the traditional front end, where we've got much more advanced NLP now than we did 20 years ago when Festival was first conceived. So I think that's a great freedom, and that's something to take home. You can be as simple as you like or as advanced as you like in the front end, and as long as your features turn out in the right format, the regression model can be the same. It will use them if they're available, and if they're not available, it'll still work. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to revisit the front end and to revisit what you might do in it, no longer constrained by having to squeeze it into, say, a unit selection system. I'm hoping you're not disappointed by the incredibly small amount of material on neural networks in a tutorial that was supposed about deep learning for speech synthesis, but speech synthesis is the name of the game, not just deep learning, and there's an unlimited amount of other tutorials on that. I think the take-home message from that is if you're starting out, just use Merlin because it'll do what you want and it'll hide all the back-end from you, whether it's Theano or TensorFlow or whatever it is, and you can just make things work. But if you want to do more advanced things, at some point you have to tangle with those frameworks. And we're not here to give you a tutorial on how to use TensorFlow. Go and find someone who can do that for you. There's plenty of that stuff out there. So if you want to get really advanced, you need to go beyond what Merlin does or inside Merlin and go through it and see what's in the back end. And that applies for things like sequence-to-sequence models and so on. It's easier in some back ends than others. There's lots of freedoms in the front end, and I think in the waveform generation part, there's also lots of freedom now to sort of have a new think about what we've inherited from HMM, so-called HMM, what we really should call regression tree speech synthesis, what's necessary and what's not necessary. And a lot of your questions in the audience and privately during the break have been along those lines. Why do we do that? It's because we did it in HMM synthesis. Why do we use the Kepstrom? We use the Kepstrom because we needed a low-dimensional decorrelated representation that we could fit diagonal Gaussians to. That's not what we're doing in deep learning. We can deal with covariance, so we don't need to use the Kepstrom. We could use the spectrum. In fact, that's what Felipe's vocoder does. Dimensionality reduces, but it doesn't decorrelate. So we can revisit waveform generation. The ultimate, of course, is to go direct to the waveform itself, something like WaveNet. We're not talking about that. That's not our work. But there's lots of other things we can do within a more conventional vocoder framework. So I've had that literal question from many different people recently. Why do we use the Kepstrom? The answer is because we always have. But the real answer is we should rethink that and try other things. So we've got lots of freedoms in both front-end and waveform generation. So that's a big opportunity. I think if we look at the papers coming up in interspeech, and I haven't read them, it's a rash prediction without reading the papers. We're going to see an awful lot of people thinking about the architecture of their neural nets and getting pretty complicated there, but not doing very much at either end. And I think maybe that's an opportunity that you can do something pretty straightforward in the neural net architecture, do interesting linguistic features, there's a definite win to be had there, and do sensible vocoder features from which you get good reconstruction and good properties. So though people are missing opportunities there and concentrating too much on more and more complicated architectures in the middle.